Famous last words. Okay. Oh, you did find the on switch. All right. Well, oh, okay. Welcome, everybody. Um,
Okay.
I've been doing very personal introductions lately, and I'm going to continue that trend. I want you to know that I woke up this morning in Tempe, Arizona, as one does, and I was there for a kind of conference, like an unconference pop-up city thing that the kids are doing these days, and I was having a lovely time. I was there for several days. The weather was beautiful. Tempe, Arizona, turns out, very nice place. And I got myself to the airport and got on an airplane just to be here tonight for this. So I'm very excited to have David Odorisio back in effect at Alembic. I have never before had the experience of having to pull the microphone away from my mouth because I was too excited, but that's what just happened. David also came here on a plane today, and so have other audience members. So this may have our highest rate of people getting on airplanes and flying to Alembic for an event. We may have set a record today. We're not necessarily tracking, but maybe we should be. So enthusiasm is high. So I'm glad you're all here. I'm really looking forward to this evening. That being said, I'm going to talk to you for a minute before we start. So I want to let you know a few things that are coming up and just what Alembic is. So how many of you have kind of wandered in out of the ether and have never been to Alembic before? And welcome. Hi. So do you know what an Alembic is? Not to single you out. You can just nod or shake your head or something. Yeah. That's true. That's a picture of an Alembic. Also, nice move putting our logo on your title slide. This is a professional right here. So an Alembic is still used today in distillation of spirits, but it was invented by a female alchemist. And it's the literal vessel that the alchemists used for transformation. So you can make a lot of nice metaphors about alchemy and like the body and the mind is its own alembic where transformation happens. But there was like a literal object that was an alembic, and the alchemists believed that in order for whatever you put into an alembic to transform properly, you would have to set up conditions in the world correctly, but also in your mind correctly. So an alembic is a place where mind and matter meet and transform. And that's our goal and aspiration for this space that we're all in together this evening. And so we offer all different classes, workshops, lectures, some events that sort of defy categorization. We had an improv event last week, and I don't know what they were up to in there, but there were some noises coming out of the room. So we do all sorts of things. And the idea is that you can come here and you can try a lot of different things. And we curate it all for you. So if you like something, you should be happy that you found it. If you hate something, you can email us. We can talk about it. And the idea is you can bounce off a lot of different things until you find the thing that feels like the thing you really want to go deep with at this moment in your practice or in your life. And you'll be able to go deep with that thing, all while being sort of held by the wider community. It's like a meta community, a community of communities. So that's the big picture goal. We've been here for about 3 years, and I think we're doing pretty well. I mean, we've got David here, so I'm counting that as a win. David's here tonight, and then he's also going to be here all day tomorrow doing a workshop, and I'll let him tell you guys more about that at the end of this evening. And a few other things that are coming up that you might enjoy are this Sunday, we have Alembic co-founder Eric Davis and his partner, Jennifer, and they're going to be leading a discussion of practice. So like, what is practice? How is your practice going? And they do this about twice a year. So it's a relatively rare event, but it's a chance to talk about practice in all its forms with people who are very familiar with the deep and weird end of practice. So that's Sunday afternoon. And then Sunday evening, we have our friend of Alembic, Bex, here doing her Soma Nidra series. This is like a relaxation meditative series for nerds. So each sort of episode, she does a different system. And the last one, she did the circulatory system. Before that, she did like get to know your organs. So she's like doing a guided meditation, but about like a different anatomical system. And then she's also doing it from like a yoga nidra lens. So yoga nidra is a fancy word for you're allowed to fall asleep during the meditation, and it's okay. Not really, but also yes, really. So that's on Sunday evening. And then next weekend, we have Kat Harrison here doing an event called Dreaming the Cure. And that is about healing practices in different folk traditions. If you haven't met Kat, she's the co-founder of a botanical nonprofit that she co-founded with her now late husband, Terrence McKenna. And she is one of those, it's called Botanical Dimensions. And she just straight up talks to plants. And I didn't believe that that was possible until I met Kat. And then I was like, no, okay, you talk to plants. And she can teach us how to do that. So just being in her presence, like honestly, I'm not just saying this, like I just come to whatever Kat is doing. I don't even look at the title anymore. It's like that thing you do in college where you just take the professor. Like just being in the same room with Kat is amazing. And then this in particular, the topic is really good also. So that's next Sunday. Okay, I will now cease being the thing that is between you and David Odorisio, because I don't want to be that thing anymore. I want to give you, please help me welcome David Odorisio.
Thank you. Thanks, Katie. And thank you, Alana, who's out there, and Emily, who's back there, and Eric, who's over the bridge or something. I love coming here. I lived in West Berkeley for 2 years when I was a doctoral student at the California Institute of Integral Studies in the Mission. I am originally from Philadelphia, and I have always had a very strange energetic attraction to Berkeley. I think it's how most people end up here, whether it's for life or for a period of time. I went to a I guess you could call it fairly middle left of center Catholic undergraduate college, and my undergraduate mentor, who was a Franciscan priest and my theology professor, he of course referred to it as Berserkly. And he's the first one I ever heard say, what was it? Something like, anything that's not nailed down on the East Coast rolls west. I'm sure people have heard that phrase before, which I found to be wonderfully true. And I think the Alembic is probably the best case of that, of all things that celebrate the weird. So I'm very happy to be here. I love the Alembic. I now live outside Santa Barbara. I'm a professor at Pacifica Graduate Institute. And I just love coming back here, and I love having a reason to come. I love having this be the reason that I get to come back here. So thank you, Katie, for hosting and inviting. And yeah, thank you all for showing up. There's lots and lots of things you could be doing on a Friday night, even if it was just walking around the neighborhood, smelling the jasmine. But you decided to come here. And I'd like to know why. But before we do that, I'm going to invite you to take just a few minutes. Let's just sit and ground. We've already had a lot of words in a short period of time. Everybody's had a week. A lot of people have had a month or two. So let's take a moment to just breathe together and find some center. And just notice what you are carrying with you in your physical form this evening. Maybe there's a physical tightness or space or something that could use some release. Maybe there's a color or a sound or something in your inner sphere that just needs a little bit of tending to. Just take a minute to be present with whatever is this evening. And if it feels right, let's take a deep inhale together. And release. We'll do that one more time. Okay. And when it feels right, just gently opening your eyes, just softly. First making contact with the floor. And then only if or when it feels right for you, just take a look around the space and see if your eyes just naturally land on someone else here in the room, and just give them a little nod. Hello. I see you. You are welcome here. All of you is welcome here. Okay. I had a fun moment this morning. I knew I'd be coming like right from the airport to here, and it's never taken me so long in my life to choose my socks, because I knew that these were the socks that you were all going to see tonight. Isn't that a nice thing about coming to the Alembic? It strips us down to our bare form. Our socks. Anybody have holes in their socks? Then I won't want to go there. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. It's very humbling. So tell me why you're here. It can be a word. I'd prefer short words. Short, not phrases, what I'm trying to say. We don't need to get into story time, but curiosity, something, whatever. Yeah, please.
Walter Wink.
Walter Wink.
You know,
Why do I know that name?
he's a theologian.
Walter Wink. I know that name. Oh, okay. All right. Well, now I want to know. Now I have to tell the story. What is it about? Well, just the abbreviated version. Like,
Sure.
So why? What is it about Walter? I'm thinking of the character from
Oh God.
Walter White.
Right. No relation. No relation at all. There was a book called Engaging the Powers that I read that changed my life. It was one of the probably top 5 life-changing books that I read in high school. I grew up in a Lutheran church, like a middle-of-the-road church, and was kind of ready to drop it. And this book completely changed how I think about it. It was kind of integral to Christianity for
Great.
to try to.
What year was that book published?
That's a good question. They just had the 50th anniversary, but I want to say, so it must have been around when I was born. So 73, early 70s. I
Great.
would say. I'm going to try not to Google it.
Okay, thank
Maybe
you.
it's the 25th.
I'll Google it when I go home.
Yeah.
Appreciate that. Anybody else? Why are you here? That's a mischievous. You give me a very mischievous look in the front row.
I'm a student.
You're a student? What?
I'm a PhD student. I study psychedelics.
Where are you a student at?
I'm at GTU.
Oh, yes. I was hoping for at least one. Is anybody else here a GTU student? Just you? Two? Oh, great. Guy, who are you studying with? Now I want to know.
Sam Shankar.
Oh, Sam. Okay, great. Love Sam. Wonderful. Sam's been here. Right? Yeah. Two more people. Why are you here?
Katie and then one other woman said they were taking planes back from events to come to see you. And so I came knowing nothing.
From a plane?
Well, just that Katie said, she's like, I'm flying back for this.
Oh.
She's like, I'm flying back early from something to like make this event.
So FOMO. You're here with
Or I
FOMO.
was really trusted two women that I would trust, like if they were like, they found it important enough to attend this. And I mean, I also am very curious about the Christianity aspect of that, being raised Catholic, and you know, I don't know what you will speak to, but I'm curious about mysticism and Christianity.
Great. Wonderful. All right. Thank you, Katie. Okay. One more? Anybody? Someone who's maybe uber skeptical or angry or something? Maybe that's not you. You can go anyway, please.
Oh, yeah, I'm skeptical.
Oh, okay. Good. Great.
I mean, I've enjoyed psychedelics for many years, and I guess to a first order approximation, I've never known anyone who, for instance, has taken ayahuasca, and I thought they had any objective improvement in their life whatsoever. And I've been curious about kind of integrating what seems like a maybe kind of mystical thing, psychedelics, with Christianity.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're in the right place. Great. We'll talk a little bit about that point in particular. You didn't use the word. What was the word you used? Improvement? What was it? You didn't say moral or ethical improvement. You just said, what was your exact words?
I mean, if I'm being frank, I tend to observe that people who do ayahuasca make their lives worse.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
For instance, quitting jobs with no kind of rebound in the next few years.
Okay. We'll talk about some of that because that's some of the well, I don't want to ruin the show, but thank you. Thanks for being honest. Appreciate that. All right. One more. Then I swear we'll move on. Yeah, please.
I've had my own experience and my own thoughts, during pandemic and isolation. I've gone through a whole bunch of stuff, and now I want to hear what a professional thinks of it.
Whoa. Where's that? Okay. That's a tall order. I'll try to be professional. Thank you. Okay. I think I'll start by saying what we're not gonna talk about. We can talk about this in like Q&A. Q&A is like open forum, like anything goes. So I'll present for probably like 30 minutes, and then we'll talk for maybe like 20 minutes, and then we'll probably take a short break, and then because I drank a lot of tea before we started, and then we'll do the same thing. I'll present for probably 30 minutes, and then we'll talk for the rest of the time because I really want to have a conversation and hear where you are at, and why you're here. This is a conversation that I don't hear a whole lot of people having, but it's a conversation that I think Eric Davis, who's one of the co-founders here, he's also done some teaching at Pacifica and some of our public programs and stuff. One of the things I really love about Eric is he really appreciates like the Jesus freak stuff from like back in the 70s and like the Jesus people movement. But Christianity really hasn't, I'm sure, this statement can be qualified and someone's going to want to footnote it, but like Christianity hasn't really been part of the spiritual but not religious kind of movement. You know, like this is not a knock at the Alembic, it's not a knock at anything. It's just when you look at the calendar of like your local yoga studio or you know, I don't know, I guess even here, maybe to a certain extent, like you're not seeing like weekly prayer groups, or you're not seeing like anything that's sort of like Christocentric, unless it's, you know, well, I don't have the image up yet, but this gentleman's t-shirt kind of speaks for itself.
This does not get
Oh.
out of the world.
Okay, I'm glad it can get out into the world tonight. Christianity is kind of not cool right now, and it hasn't been, I think, for a while. And I think there's lots of reasons for that. In large part, the quote unquote spiritual but not religious movement, the sort of American turn towards Eastern traditions was reactionary against Christian currents in really like pre-1960s culture and even after. And the general sort of like meta narrative of that is that Christianity wasn't meeting people's needs when it came to things quote unquote spiritual or mystical. In other words, that Christianity had basically become about the doctrine and a set of moral or ethical imperatives that I think for a lot of people didn't think that that's really what the church was doing or following themselves. And that certainly continued in the 21st century. So hypocrisy, and then of course, religious abuse, spiritual trauma, the list goes on and on and on and on. Rampant homophobia, lack of inclusion of women in positions of authority. I mean, it's like, you know, it's not really a sell. You know, I hate to put it in terms of like brand, but it's not like really a sell for people these days. Most of the students that are coming to, you know, Pacifica are folks that are recovering from growing up in organized religion, oftentimes evangelical Christianity, you know, because we are located, you know, mostly in Southern California. So we get a lot of like recovering evangelical folks. And there's a lot of resentments. There's a lot of resentment that I encourage students to work on, because, you know, as they say, you know, the many folks here that are in recovery know, you know, resentment is, I don't really know a catchy AA phrase for it, but resentment's a bitch. And resentment in the 12-step program is really at the core of what people think a lot of addictive behavior is behind. So I think it's important to work on our spiritual resentments, you know, regardless of where they stem from, but, you know, particularly regarding Christianity. And I'm not here to like make Christianity cool again. Like that's not at all like my MO or my paradigm. I'm not even gonna like pretend to speak on behalf of, I do not speak on behalf of the church. And I'm not even really gonna speak on behalf of a tradition, except for the Christian mystical tradition, because that's what I feel mostly aligned with. And that's what my own personal professional background is in. So I will try to be a professional. And what we're going to do is we're going to really put the Christian mysticism piece in conversation with the psychedelic piece. How did that happen for me? Well, it happened through this figure who I will introduce to you in a moment, Thomas Merton. Is anybody here familiar with the person or the writings of Thomas Merton? Wow, that's crazy. That was like 85% of the room. See, now that's amazing, because Christianity might not have made its way into the counterculture so much, or, you know, the sort of spiritual but not religious kind of new age crystal stuff, but somehow Thomas Merton has. And that's what's crazy to me, is that I mean, there's folks here from the whole spectrum, you know, developmental spectrum of life. And people raised their hands that were like, I don't age people anymore now that I'm an aging person, but young folks were like, yes, I know who Thomas Merton is. Folks who are on the other spectrum of young in spirit raised their hands like, I know who Thomas Merton is. Something is about this 20th century Catholic Trappist monk continues to appeal to people. And one of the reasons for that is because what Merton did in the mid 20th century is he was doing something then that I truly mean this. He was doing something then that really no one else was doing, or at least very few people were doing. And he was returning to the sources of the tradition. So he was, I'm going into my Merton intro. It's not time for that, but I'm going to do it now. Merton was training and teaching young novices at his Trappist monastery in Kentucky. And he was going back to the sources of the tradition in a time when the Trappist community was very rigid and institutionalized. You wake up at 3 a.m., you go to prayer, it's 45 minutes, you have 15 minutes to break, then you have 2 hours where you're supposed to do, private personal reading or meditation, or you have to go bake the bread, and then you go back to church, and then you go to breakfast, and then you go back to church again. The whole life was absolutely routinely institutionalized. It was a machine for making monks and cheese. And now fudge, which is very delicious, by the way. Right? What he did was he was going back to the Greek and the Latin sources of the tradition. He was reading the early desert monastic tradition, the desert fathers, the desert mothers. He was reading the medieval Christian mystics, and then he was translating these traditions for another generation of young monastic seekers. And not only that, but it was coming through in his public published writings, which were selling, and I hate to use the metaphor of wildfire these days, but they were very, very popular. Okay, so there's something about Merton that transects. Did I use that correctly? Transects, I guess. These different sort of things that we've parsed out over, what is cool or what is spiritual but not religious, and what is not, and what is mystical, and what is, like, Merton's kind of made his way into Buddhist circles, and Zen people read Merton, and Sufis read Merton, and I don't know, like neo-Hasidic Jewish folks read Thomas Merton. And part of the reason for that is because Merton was interested in those traditions, and Merton was reading them. And he was, in addition to that, as we'll get into in a minute, he also became very interested in the psychedelic counterculture of the 1960s, because he lived it. Even though he was in a monastery, cloistered behind monastic walls, he was someone who was very, very open to the counterculture and what was happening at that time in the 1960s. So he's the bridge. So this is really, it's a talk about Merton, but it's also a talk about one of probably the most influential Christian mystics in the history of Christianity, and that's St. John of the Cross. So we're actually going to go deeper into St. John of the Cross than Merton, but Merton intersects the whole thing and ties it together. Okay? Great. So this is what we're not going to talk about tonight, okay? There is so much discourse, and I don't just mean books and blogs and lectures. I mean, it's just, there's certificate programs and trainings and chaplaincy programs and books upon books upon books that are being published, podcasts, interviews about psychedelics. You all know this because you live in Berkeley or you live in the Bay and you hang out at the Alembic. So you know this because the Alembic is one of the major discourse producers around psychedelics, probably in the East Bay or in the Bay Area as a whole. So we have to do some demarcation these days. We can't just say we're talking about psychedelics because it's become such a huge industry, really, of ideas and research and scholarship and pop culture and popular knowledge. So I'm not going to talk about the thing that's become so huge because of my other fellow Philadelphian, Brian Murarescu's book, The Immortality Key. Now, Brian recatalyzed this whole origins of religion conversation, which is something that's a couple decades old at this point. Did psychedelics, did mushrooms, were they somehow at the origins of the discovery of religion or certain religions? And Brian brings back up the whole, are psychedelics at the origins of Christianity? Was Jesus a mushroom conversation? Which is a fun conversation to have. That's a wild historical reimagining, right? Jesus was a mushroom. Great. We're not going to do that tonight. We can have fun with it. We can talk about it in the Q&A. There's a whole history of that tradition. We're not going to dive into that so much. I did notice that one of the books in your lovely library out there by Dan Merker is called The Psychedelic Sacrament. And Dan Merker's argument is that it was actually some sort of, when was it the Israelite people who ate manna in the desert, that the manna was actually some sort of psychedelic something or other. Moses was having a psychedelic experience when he saw the burning bush. You see where this sort of psychedelic reimagining hermeneutic goes. It's all of a sudden anything that's weird or spectacular or anomalous, whether it's in the prophetic books of the Bible or whether it's the existence of Jesus himself, comes down to this sort of psychedelic reductionism. And that's why I'm not super in favor of it. It's fun to play with as like a hermeneutic lens. You know what that means. That's a $5 GTU word. It becomes easy in a certain sense. Like it's fun, but it's easy. And what it also does, that kind of psychedelic reductionism, it doesn't allow the human being to be weird in and of itself. Like human beings have mystical experiences regardless of what you're ingesting or not, I think, right? So I think to put too much on psychedelics doesn't do justice to just how weird it is to be a human being to begin with, right? So I want to put that up front from the beginning. I'm not trying to like sell the psychedelic origins thing. And I want to really, I'll be an academic again. I want to trouble the category, of mysticism and psychedelics, because as we know, because of this landmark study from 2006, that's really when people started talking about, particularly in like scientific research circles, started talking about mysticism and putting it in conversation with psychedelics. And eventually assuming that people that are taking certain psychedelics, high doses of psilocybin, for example, in controlled research environments are having mystical experiences, okay? There's so much like critical, like religious studies people are very critical of that idea because they're historians. So they want to say, well, mysticism, you have to look at specific mystics and you have to look at them in context of the 12th century and this and that. I don't want to do that either, okay? I'm not a historical reductionist. I'm not a psychedelic reductionist. If I'm anything, I'm a practitioner who knows some stuff professionally, and I want to talk to you as practitioners because I think that's primarily probably why you're interested in this stuff and maybe why you're here. So for tonight, and for those of you who come back tomorrow, I'm mostly interested in this from a practitioner perspective because at least in my imagination, that's why people come to the Alembic, right? It's not just about ideas, it's also how do I put this into practice in my life, okay? So this is all the stuff we're not gonna talk about, but it's also the context, it's on the waters that this conversation is swimming in, and it's also a lot of what came after. So when we talk about the Thomas Merton stuff, and we talk about psychedelics and mysticism in the 1960s, none of this stuff existed yet. That's the other thing to keep in mind, right? It was still new, especially for some of you who lived it. It was new, it was fresh, it was on the edge, it was dangerous, it was probably very scary and also very exciting. And a lot of it happened right here in our backyard, right? So where does our journey, where does our story tonight begin? It begins in 1958, although we're not quite there yet, but it begins with Aldous Huxley. And I'm not going to do a lot of intro with Huxley because there's a lot of stuff out there on Huxley. There's probably a lot of stuff that's happened here on Huxley. How many folks here have read The Doors of Perception at some point in their life? Okay, well, pretty good. So Huxley writes a book published in 1954, The Doors of Perception, which is about his experiences with mescaline. All right. Becomes very, very popular, particularly among, at that time, the beat counterculture. This is 1950s American counterculture. And I don't want to detour too much. But what Huxley does is that he offers a frame for how to interpret psychedelic experience. And it comes through his frame that he had
previously published as the perennial philosophy. So Huxley's mysticism comes from within a kind of perennialism. And what that means is that mystical experiences are seen to all emerge from one and the same sort of tradition. It's not about Christian mysticism, or it's not about non-dual Vedic mysticism or spirituality. It's mysticism as this sort of broad umbrella category, and it just happens to all emerge in all these different traditions. Does that make sense? What Huxley does is he treats mysticism as a universal kind of thing that anyone that's a human being can experience. So he kind of democratizes the mystical experience. It fits in really well with the psychedelic frame, as we'll get to in a minute. Does that make sense? That's kind of important, right? The universal frame, all religions sort of meet at the top in this sense, psychedelic mysticism, right? That's kind of a general belief among a lot of spiritual but not religious folks, is that a spiritual experience or a mystical experience, it's available to everybody. It's actually the same for everybody. It doesn't matter if you're a Hindu or a Sufi or a Christian, you're all having the same experience of the ultimate or consciousness or God, or the terms don't matter because everything falls away because you're all having the same experience. Make sense? There might be some folks here that might be perennialists or universalists or whatever. Okay, I'm not arguing for or against it, but that's the perspective and the worldview that Huxley's coming from. Okay, that's really important when we get to Merton in a minute. So Huxley is in correspondence back in the days when people would write letters to each other with a psychiatrist, a British psychiatrist named Humphrey Osmond. And look at this wonderful comic book cartoon I found. I was hoping Eric would be here because he probably owns the original or something like that. He's like, oh, I actually know those people. I was there when it was born. I have to do that. Okay. So Huxley is writing to Osmond, and this is what he writes, because they're trying to come up with a name. The term psychedelics hasn't been invented yet, so they're trying to come up with a name of how to describe this. So Huxley writes, to make this trivial world sublime, take a half a gram of phenerethine. Now, Huxley was a very smart person. He actually went back to his Liddell and Scott, his Greek lexicon, and he found words in Greek that he could put together that meant spirit manifesting. Phenerethine doesn't really have the ring, does it? So this is what Osmond writes back to him. To fathom hell or soar angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic. And the word is born, right? So this is where the original term comes from. Psychedelic, taking the Greek words psyche, which is soul or mind, delos, manifesting, so mind manifesting, which is not that far off from how a lot of scientific psychedelic researchers are describing psychedelics as non-specific amplifiers. Right? They amplify whatever's in your consciousness.
Can you break down the phenerethine Greek etymology?
Spirit manifesting is what I found.
Well,
So
the spirit makes sense, but I don't get delos makes sense. This is trivial.
The spirit side is making sense to you. The manifesting makes sense to me.
you're talking about the actual words, right?
Yeah.
You're talking about the actual etymology.
Yeah.
I think there's different.
For the manifesting, how are you getting spirit out of erythine?
Well, so you would think that it would be something like pneuma, right, or something that's from. Is that what you're thinking?
It's the same word as phantom.
That was what I was thinking.
Cool. That makes sense then.
There you go.
Yeah.
It's been a long time since I took Greek.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, so origins of the term, right? In 1958, Huxley publishes. Eric probably has this too, by the way. His collection, I bet you. Although he wasn't alive. Okay, I'll be careful what I say. I'll stop teasing you from afar. I know he's a club. You know who has? I bet you Christian Greer has this. Christian Greer has the original copy of this. I think.
I would not be surprised.
Okay, sorry. I'll stop name dropping, folks. I know it's really obnoxious. Okay, in 1958, Huxley publishes a short little essay in the Saturday Evening Post. I do want to know what the great California political drama was, though, in October of 1958. Does anybody know? I don't know.
Curious about college football.
Yeah.
I know, it's all interesting. The Russians are in Antarctica, college football is collapsing. 1958 was a lot happening now. Okay. So I also love this image, by the way. The image is worth commenting on because it's really the birth of stuff. I mean, this is like the birth of American commodification of things. Like we have like, you know, they're basically putting together their pre-IKEA furniture, like getting your groceries. Like they're doing all of the American consumer things, which is actually really important because the birth of American consumerism is what's behind Merton's critique of psychedelics, which is what we're going to get to in a minute. So just wanted to point that out. Okay, so Huxley writes a short little essay that you can still read. It's actually published in this edition of the Doors of Perception. It's the appendix. It's worth reading. It's very prophetic because what Huxley does in this essay is he predicts, and this is an exact quote, he predicts a revival of religion. Okay, this is through psychedelics. A revival of religion through biochemical discoveries that will make it possible for large numbers of people to achieve radical self-transcendence and a deeper understanding of the nature of things. Okay. Spot on. When administered in the right kind of psychological environment, it's sensitive to set and setting, these chemical mind changers make possible a genuine religious experience. Now, this isn't the first time that an intellectual elite has made the connection between altered states of consciousness and religious or mystical experience. As you all probably know, William James famously did this in his 1902 Varieties of Religious Experience because of his own experience with nitrous. Right? So there's a long history in the sort of we'll call it anglicized, the American-British conversation about psychedelics and religion. Huxley is now entered into this conversation with his Doors of Perception, his perennial philosophy, and this very, very public statement that he's made here, okay? So what ends up happening next? Our friend Thomas Merton, who's in a Trappist monastery in Kentucky in 1958, and these are his words, some old Catholic ladies send him a letter informing him of Huxley's article. And apparently Merton gets a copy of this and he reads it and he ends up writing Huxley a letter about it. Now, briefly, because you all know who this person is, but some of you don't. Actually, I feel like I'm on a roll here. How much Merton background how much of a professional do I need to be? How much Merton background do people want to hear right now? A little bit?
I would hear tons, but
Me too.
Okay, all right. I'll do the Cliff Notes version, which is basically what this is. So Merton is born in France. He's the son of two artists. His father is from New Zealand. His mother is from Long Island. He loses both of his parents at a young age. So his mother dies of brain cancer, I think, when he's 5 or 6 years old, and then his father dies of a brain tumor when he's in his teens. So Merton is effectively orphaned by, I think, the age of 16 or so. Okay, so that's a pause in and of itself, right? That's a tremendous amount of loss and trauma for a young person. And one way that a person would perhaps cope with that is by basically experiencing radical freedom, at the age of 16 or 17. So when he goes to Cambridge, he does not study, let's just put it that way. He spends his time doing other things that ultimately lead to him being removed from Cambridge by his uncle, his mother's family. So he leaves the UK and he enters Columbia. He ends up graduating from Columbia. He actually does a master's degree at Columbia on William Blake and William Blake's visionary poetry and Blake's fourfold vision, for those of you that are Blake fans. And during his time at Columbia, he has this sort of radical conversion experience, and he becomes baptized at Corpus Christi, which is a very cool spot on the Upper West Side near Columbia, if any of you know it or have been there. He ends up landing a job teaching English at St. Bonaventure's College in Olean, upstate New York. He tries to enter the Franciscans, but when he tells the Franciscans what he was up to when he was in the UK at Cambridge, they don't let him enter because one of those facts of his life is that he fathered a child. And scholars think that, and he thinks, Merton himself, the mother and his child never sort of like revealed themselves, especially after he became very famous. So the assumption is that they both died during the London bombing in World War II, which is very sad. So it just adds another layer to the sort of very human experience of this person. So when he tells the Franciscans this story, they don't let him enter. So he basically has a child out of wedlock. In 1941, he has a life-changing experience. He makes a retreat during Easter at the Trappist monastery of Our Lady of Gethsemane, which is about an hour south of Louisville. And they accept him. So he enters on December 10th. Now, December 10th is a very important date because December 10th is the day that Merton enters the Trappists, and it's also the day that he dies in 1968. In 1948, 20 years before his death, he writes an autobiography called The Seven-Story Mountain. It becomes an almost immediate overnight success, something that he absolutely was not anticipating because most of his novels had been rejected by publishers for years before he entered the monastery. So he enters the monastery, he gives up being a literary figure only to become probably the most famous Catholic monk priest in the world. Okay, so all of a sudden the letters and the fan mail and people wanting to meet him, people coming to the monastery to become monks because they read his autobiography and had such a powerful experience that they wanted to be close to the magnet, the spiritual juju too. Right? He created a movement of, well, I guess what you could call post-war monastic fervor in America. Hundreds of men started flocking to Trappist monasteries after the Second World War. There were so many men coming to monasteries that they had to start making what they call daughter houses. They had to make other foundations because there were at one time 200 monks in Kentucky. Right? So they would send them, start another foundation in Georgia, start a foundation in Mississippi, start a foundation in Utah, start a foundation in Colorado, start a foundation in Northern California. Right? So the Trappists spread all over in this country, mostly because of this period. So Merton was tremendously influential in the explosion of interest in monasticism in the 40s and 50s in this country. In the 50s and the 60s, his horizons start to expand rapidly. He gets very interested in Zen in the 50s. Zen, again, was part of the Beat counterculture. So like, Kerouac and Ginsberg and folks, Zen was very much a part of the counterculture before Tibetan Buddhism and Hindu gurus started coming in the 60s, right? So Zen sort of predated the arrival of these other sort of Asian tantric traditions that arrived in the 60s, right? So Zen comes first. And Merton gets very interested in Zen, very formative in his developing of his own worldview. And that influence comes out in some of his most celebrated books. New Seeds of Contemplation. He did a translation of the Taoist master Zhuangzi. his book Mystics and Zen Masters. One of his last books was called Zen and the Birds of Appetite. So Zen is all throughout the last decade of his life. And then in 1968, on December 10th, when he was in Bangkok for a conference, a Pan-Asian monastic conference, he dies under very mysterious circumstances in his room. They found his body on the floor with a fan laying over him with a deep burn mark. And it appears that he had come out of the shower. I don't think the sort of traditional narrative is that he grabbed the fan. I mean, I don't know about you folks, but I don't know. A lot of people aren't grabbing plugged in appliances when they get out of the shower and stepping on a tile floor. My sense is that he probably had a heart attack and then maybe like reached and grabbed the fan and then he got electrocuted. And then because he had a burn mark, but then he also had blood on the back of his skull where he probably fell and hit his head. So some combination of perhaps those three things killed him. He was 53 years old. So that's the nutshell of this extraordinary human who, for someone who barely left a 50-mile radius for most of his life, had such an extraordinary impact, really on the world and the revival of contemplative spirituality and mysticism in the 20th century that is still alive today. Yeah, did you have a question?
Was he practicing Zen, like meditating Zen?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Shigatasa, koans, or-
Well, he was. So this is important. That's a great question. He was close with D.T. Suzuki.
Okay.
So Suzuki was his mentor, and at the time, Suzuki was like the face of Zen in America. Now, since scholars, because this is what scholars like to do, they criticize and they point at things. Suzuki's been criticized because of his psychological approach to Zen, or that it was an intellectual approach to Zen. However you want to frame it, that's the influence, and that's what Merton was getting. So really, Suzuki was his source. Yeah. But he did have a meditation practice. He took his meditation practice very seriously. Yes.
Well, is this a place to mention the very end of his life in the Tibetan lamas and Lama Chakra?
We can talk about that.
I mean, in terms of mystical experiences.
So let's do that. So just briefly, Merton was in. He went all over India. He was gone for he was gone for 3 months. So first he came to California. He went to Alaska. He went to California, and then he went to Asia, which was mostly India and Sri Lanka. So while he's in the Himalayas, he was very interested in meeting Tibetan lamas. And one of those lamas was Shachal Rinpoche, who some of you that are in Nyingmapa tradition, or some of you that are in Dzogchen lineages would know Shachal, because he was one of the most realized, or he's considered one of the most realized Dzogchen masters of the 20th century. Merton meets him and has an extraordinary experience. And he says that if he was ever going to settle down with a lama, it would be Shachal Rinpoche. We could do a whole talk on that. Maybe we will at some point. But very important. So weeks before the end of his life, here he is, very interested in what is the clear light. Tibetan lamas that he met were giving him certain practices, one of which was the POA practice, about the transmission of consciousness, like basically to shoot your consciousness out of your skull. It's like preparation for death practice. Merton didn't know. He writes in his journal something about shooting, the lamas are trying to teach me how to shoot my consciousness out of my fontanelle. Weird, He doesn't know why they're doing this, but a scholar who taught in Europa for most of her career, was a student of Chogyam Rinpoche, Judith Simmer Brown. She thinks that these lamas knew that he was going to die, so they were giving him the practices that were appropriate to where he was at that point in his life. Very mysterious, very mysterious. Okay, great questions. Thanks. It's 8:00. The time is flying. I drank a lot of tea, as I mentioned. So can we do, if I say 5 minutes, then we'll do 7 minutes.
Exactly.
So I'll say 5 minutes, but then we'll really do 7 minutes? Okay,
Ring the bell after 5 minutes.
great. Okay, we'll do a break and then we'll pick right back up with the Merton Huxley stuff. Okay, thanks everybody.
Sorry to go, but I'll go later. I don't want to be. There's actually one. There's a church that is
David talking about
the whole list of like all of our which is like don't get me wrong, right? Like,
Yes.
they're beautiful, like, but for an hour, like it's just tough.
Oh, there you
So yeah,
go.
we never really found the church. My wife was raised Catholic. But across the bridge from where our house is, church, and she's done to Christmas videos and stuff. I've not there because like I've been told specifically.
Well, I was going to ask you about
Like, I'm like, it's
I've never been to a service. I've been
Don't worry.
I'm sure I've been. One of my favorite places to go something about all this stuff.
I live here.
They weren't even the power sheet.
No, because it's
I think it was so good. I saw your message. And I was like, it was so
I've been there for like
I'm so excited for that work.
Yeah, no, me too. James Drake. She was at Maria's birthday. She was all the way on the side, and
I'm sort of, my imagination probably.
and she was like, take these home and burn them. But because I knew cat, I stuck it under my pillow first. So you feel like
I love that.
I don't know how, but I'm really serious. Like, how these like
Over the hill.
But I started
when you said that thing, that's like really what I thought.
That's part two.
This just lines up like this.
So, yeah.
Right now, right?
She said like the most common false revelations go to
So,
South America.
Is it day 7 grade? Sorry.
Yes.
To bring
No.
to
No.
I was just checking with
Hello? Hello? What?
I did nothing. I rang no bell. Everyone just came.
You know, it's cool. It's cool to see if people come back because it's late.
Well, often
You know, it's late. It's 8 o'clock.
It's like sometimes the event is psychedelics, and then you give people a 5-minute break, but they just go.
Normally, I'd be in my pajamas right now. At least I'm in my socks. Okay. Welcome back. All right, now we're gonna get into it. I did all my scholarly framing and mapping and professional stuff. Now we're just gonna get into it, and should take, let's see, maybe 30 minutes or so. We'll see. Okay, so if you recall, before we did our deep dive there into Merton's life, we were talking about Aldous Huxley and the origins of the term psychedelic, and Huxley's letter in the Saturday Evening Post, where he predicted a revival of religion through biochemical technologies. Okay. Now this is Merton, on a little bit of a high horse, which he's known to have done in his time. This is Merton writing to Huxley in just 2 weeks or so after that Saturday the Post article. Okay, so these are Merton's words. You being Huxley, may argue that the use of a koan, so this is the Zen piece, to dispose one for satori is not different from the use of a drug. So that's the perennialist position, okay? That there's no difference between a koan or psilocybin because they're both predisposing one towards some sort of universal mystical experience. Okay, that's the Huxley perennialist position. Merton is disagreeing. He is saying that I would like to submit that there is all the difference in the world. So Merton is coming from more of a, what we could call a traditionalist position, more of a contextualist position, right? This is someone who is a vowed monastic practitioner and a priest, right? He's arguing for difference versus Huxley's sameness. Now that's an important hermeneutic frame in this whole psychedelic mysticism conversation. Sameness versus difference, right? It's the big sticking point today in the psychedelic scientific community, who are sort of more on the perennialist camp, and the religious studies historian people who are arguing more for the sake of difference and respecting individual cultures or the indigenous communities in which the plants or medicines emerge from, right? They're two different frames. They each have valid points, but they're two different frames. Okay. So Merton, in his letter, differentiates between an experience which is essentially aesthetic and natural versus an experience which is mystical and supernatural. Now, this also needs some theological context. What does he mean by this? Well, in traditional Catholic theology, there's a difference that is made between a natural religious or spiritual experience, just by the sake that you're a human being, you're in nature, you're experiencing awe or oneness with God or the cosmos. That's a natural, in this framework, experience. A mystical experience would be a more specific union between the individual and God. That was considered an experience of grace, right? Grace. It's the grace of God that allows the individual person to unite with their creator. It is not something that sort of you can just either demand or will, or maybe even just happen in a natural environment. Now, of course, these are very arbitrary categories, as I think a lot of you are like, yeah. Like, how can you make a distinction between something that is natural versus something that is supernatural? This is a very like binary, black and white, and outdated kind of way of thinking in Catholic theology. Like, people aren't really talking like this anymore, but at that time, people were. Okay. It's just like in the old school mysticism philosophy literature from around that same time period, where people were talking about the difference between nature mysticism versus let's just call it ecstatic or like theistic or God-centered mysticism. It's all based on this kind of historical prejudice against nature and the natural world, which Sam and I were talking about a little bit earlier. Right, that's the background here. Is that somehow like there's something about nature that's either somehow fallen or less than, or it's fallible or flawed. So there's a privileging of the sort of supernatural transcendence, upward kind of approach to mysticism or spirituality versus more of a nature-based or like earth-centered. All the traditions that folks have worked so hard to recover basically in the last 50 years because we're destroying our planet, because most of the perceptions have been trying to escape nature, escape matter, escape the body. That's the kind of puritanical Christianity that most people in this country grew up with. Even if you didn't grow up Christian, it's in the ether, right? So this distinction, I think, deserves attention because it's some of the spiritual trauma that a lot of us have carried with us throughout our life. Even if we don't buy into it, it's still in us. It's part of this whole mind-body split, this whole nature-spirit split, that somehow they're two different things. They're not. Right? So that's how Merton is responding to Huxley. He's sort of dropping traditional Catholic theology on him and maybe looking down his nose a little bit. Okay. And then this is the final point from his letter. Huxley endangers the whole concept of genuine mystical experience in saying that it is something that can be produced by a drug. Okay. This is someone who has never taken a psychedelic. Okay. But this is a very conservative position that you still hear today. Right. How can it be a mystical experience? How can it be authentic? How can it be X, Y, and Z if it's something that's being produced by a thing? So again, there's this sort of like pejorative use of something that is material or chemical or natural or plant-based that can somehow produce something that could be utterly, inexplicably self-transcendent. The very question itself betrays Merton's underlying frame that somehow nature and spirit are incompatible. Does that make sense? Okay. He outgrows some of his thinking, I will say, by the mid-1960s. He's challenging himself more and sort of making fun of himself a little bit more about using these terms. But in one of his very last talks, I think in Bangkok before he dies, he still uses this language of natural versus supernatural. So it was sort of trained into him, but it's also sort of a product of that time. Now, let's see what Huxley's response is.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, ask a question.
What's the difference between aesthetic and mystical?
Well, okay, so the question is, what's the difference between aesthetic and mystical? I would say there doesn't have to be one. So you can see something beautiful, aesthetic, and you can have a completely legitimate experience of God or the divine. In Merton's mind, in this sort of classical kind of Catholic framework, they're making a distinction between aesthetics or aesthetic beauty versus some sort of divine or transcendent beauty.
Is it just a repetition of the difference between natural and supernatural?
Basically, yeah. I mean, you could put it along the same lines. It's the classical Catholic theology was all about hierarchies and distinctions and parsing things out and making these very clear distinctions. It was called a scholasticism or scholastic theology. It comes from Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas. It's all about these fine, precise definitions and terms. It's a very rational, logocentric way of looking at the universe. Okay. Yes.
Did Merton ever take a psychedelic?
There's no evidence.
Okay.
I was going to tell you this story later, but I'll tell you now. So some of you might know the Western tantric practitioner Anghananda Bharati, who was at the University of Syracuse. He wrote a lot of famous books. He wrote the Tantric Tradition, came out in the, 70s or 80s or something. So he was a Western practitioner and a university professor. He claims that Merton stopped in Seattle on his way to Asia and they dropped acid together. And he has this whole narrative. He said this publicly. He said this publicly at a public conference that was later published. Like, you can read it. He has this whole thing about how Merton had this whole, quantum infinity kind of experience of the cosmos and the universe. Why would you lie about something like that? But also at the same time, there's absolutely no evidence. Merton was a consummate journaler.
Yeah.
His journals were published in 7 volumes, thousands of pages. There's nothing in his itinerary that says he ever went to Seattle, and there's certainly nothing that says anything about Bharati.
I see. So no real direct evidence.
No direct evidence. Fun story. Okay, this is Huxley's response. So Merton wrote him in November. Huxley wrote him back in January. In the course of the last 5 years, I have taken mescaline twice and LSD 3 or 4 times. My first experience was mainly aesthetic. And he writes about that in Doors of Perception, where he's entranced with the fabric of his pants. And one of his whole sections of the Doors of Perception is Huxley goes to, they take him to like a CVS or something, like a store, and he's looking at art books, and he's he drank mescaline and he's looking at art books, so he's who knows what he's experiencing, but he calls that aesthetic, right? Later experiences were of another nature and helped me to understand many of the obscure utterances to be found in the writings of the mystics, Christian and Eastern. An unspeakable sense of gratitude for the privilege of being born. A transcendence of the ordinary subject-object relationship. a transcendence of the fear of death. Finally, an understanding, not intellectual, but in some sort total, of the affirmation that God is love. Absolutely beautiful. I think this is one of the most beautiful trip reports ever composed. We have no response, from Merton, because if you receive a letter like that from Aldous Huxley, what do you say? Because I imagine it was probably very humbling for him to receive this. This is extraordinary. Huxley's not interested in theological correctness. He's speaking from his heart about his own personal experience. It's stunning. It's very beautiful, and these are the types of experiences that when you read the Roland Griffiths article that I put up earlier from 2006 about psychedelics occasioning mystical type experiences. These are the types of things that people are saying when they take the so-called mystical experience questionnaire, lovingly referred to as the MEQ. Right? So, about that? I don't want to go. Okay. So the MEQ is basically oriented around this type of language, these types of experiences that they're reporting on and trying to quantify. So what do you do with that? What do you do with that? Huxley's basically saying, I don't know, this is what I experienced. It seemed pretty real to me. So I'm going to let that stand on its own because we'll circle back around to it. We don't hear much from Merton about psychedelics until about 5 years later. These are from his journals, and this is from 1965, all three of these entries. There is a regular fury of drug mysticism in this country. He could be writing about today. I am, in a way, appalled. Mysticism has finally arrived in a characteristic American mode. See, this is the critique. The critique here is not so much about psychedelics. The critique is about American consumerism. All right. You can read the rest of that. Drugs and the expansion of the American consciousness. This is great. Now the optimism is psychedelic. The American psychic orgasm, now available to all for a limited time only. Click coupon and send. This is Merton at his best. His writings as a cultural commentator and a cultural critic are really some of his most, I think, colorful. He has some. I think this is for him. Part of the role of a monk is to be a marginal person and to stand on the sides of society and critique it, because he's a person who has taken a vow of poverty. So he's from a position to critique American consumerism, the American accumulation of wealth, identifying with said wealth, right? So that's what he's seeing underneath, this sort of shadow of the psychedelic counterculture, is this kind of consuming of false promises of happiness, or consuming happiness like you might consume the latest IKEA catalog. That was a terrible analogy, but whatever the thing is that you think that you can buy that's going to make you feel better about yourself. That's what that's the critical frame that Merton's turning on psychedelic counterculture. Okay, and the last one here. The problem of psychedelics, questions of consciousness alteration as an end in itself, ? My stand on this, provisionally, is that of St. John of the Cross, on all questing for experiences. So again, it's this kind of spiritual consumerism, spiritual materialism, right? Not drugs, but night. Not visions, but nada. What does he mean by this? In order to decode this koan, we need to look at the writings and the life of St. John of the Cross himself. Okay, so who was St. John of the Cross? Most people here are probably familiar with the idea of the dark night of the soul. You've probably either heard this in some sort of popular context, or a podcast, or somebody here at the Alembic, or your best friend telling you that they're having one, or you having one and maybe not even knowing what a name is for it. You call it a midlife crisis or something. Right? So we're going to talk about the dark night of the soul, which is sort of the apex of a long history of this notion of darkness in the Christian mystical tradition. Okay, We don't have time to go through it all. We could, but we'd be here till midnight. But there's a very long genealogy of this notion of divine darkness that goes all the way back to the 4th century with some of the earliest mystical theologians like Gregory of Nyssa, this anonymous Syriac monk that scholars now refer to as Pseudo-Dionysus. And then, of course, one of the most celebrated texts of the Cloud of Unknowing, 14th century English monastic text. And then, of course, there's the celebrated 13th century German Dominican that you all know about because he's the hero of the spiritual but not religious movement, Meister Eckhart. Right? So these are all apophatic mystics. Apophatic, which comes from the Greek to unsay. And it's the opposite of cataphatic, which is things that we can say or know about the divine, which then need to be countered by the things that the ultimate reminder that the divine is always something that is beyond any conceptual category that we think we can know or say about God. God's always one step ahead, always in the darkness. We're looking for God under the flashlight, and God is the darkness that's all around us. Right? Is this a concept that's somewhat familiar? So we can keep going? Okay. So who is John of the Cross? 16th century Spaniard who was born into poverty to a single mother of 3. I read his bio described once, or his family life described as economic refugees once. Right? So these are folks who are economically disadvantaged. Because he received a scholarship, he was able to study at a Jesuit college. So he was able to receive an education. And then at 20 years old, he entered the Carmelites. So he entered a religious order. The first work that he did in the Carmelites was in a hospital where he worked with syphilis patients. When you had syphilis in the 16th century, your life didn't get better. All right. That was a bad way to go. Bad way to go. Why do I emphasize that? Because this was a person who knew tremendous suffering in their life, not only growing up in poverty, and also not only because of this, we could call chaplaincy, but also because once poor John did enter the Carmelites, his own confreres, his own Carmelite brethren, imprisoned him in a closet in a tower. Why? Because he was interested in reform. He was trying to reform the order from within. He was working with Teresa of Avila, that other great Carmelite saint. And his fellow Carmelites didn't like that, thought it was dangerous, so they locked him up. He especially spent a year of his life in a closet. A year. It was during that year that he composed some of the most beautiful mystical poetry that has come down to us in the Christian tradition. Remarkable. Okay? And it's not a surprise that one of the main metaphors and images that he plays with in his poetry are images of darkness and light. Because according to the tradition, all he could see was a sliver of light coming in through the closet, probably in the door or under the door or something. And you know how when you see light in the particles that are coming through the light, so those are the kinds of metaphors that he plays with in his poetry, as well as a lot of alchemical imagery. There's a lot of imagery of gold being refined. There's a lot of imagery of wood being consumed by flame as metaphors for the transformation of the soul. So John of the Cross is actually an extraordinary systematizer. He was a poet and he was a theologian, so he was a very right and left-brained thinker. He systematized both the apophatic and cataphatic traditions. And as I just mentioned, the scholastic theology of Thomas Aquinas with the more monastic theology that emphasizes more experience and what we could call affect, or the emotional aspect of religious experience. He writes a trilogy of mystical texts, The Ascent of Mount Carmel, The Dark Night of the Soul, and The Spiritual Canticle, among other works. And they trace this path that he crystallizes in his works as something that you've probably heard of: the purgative, the illuminative and the unitive way, as a trajectory or an itinerary of the spiritual life. Okay? Purgative, purgation, purging, cleansing, purification. Illumination, opening up, insight. Union, consummation with the beloved. Okay. He breaks down this notion of the dark night of the soul. Actually, his whole spiritual trajectory is broken down into what he calls active and passive nights. The active night is the work that we do on ourselves. It's sort of spiritual discipline. The active night is, I'm going to sit on my cushion every day for 30 minutes. Okay, spiritual discipline. Or I'm going to fast today for half the day. Or I'm going to fast for a month if I'm a Muslim, right, in Ramadan. So work done by oneself on oneself. The passive night is the work that is done on you. It's not the work that it's not you in your basement lifting weights. This is you in a fetal position on the floor with your blankie, like, why are you doing this to the universe? Okay? I'm sure everyone has had at least a drop of the latter. Okay? That's like, you're like, well, you're like me, you like to cry in the shower. You're in the shower, or you're in the closet. Wherever the places that you like to go to do the ugly cry. Right? Why is this happening to me? It's your own Job moment, if you know the book of Job from the Bible. Right? But even more than this, so this is the systematic theologian in him. He breaks this down even more. So not only is there an active and passive aspect to the spiritual life, it works itself out on you in two different levels. At the level of the senses and the level of our spiritual self. So the senses, the sense aspect of our psyche, basically our addictions, our attachments, our inordinate desires, our cravings. So the active and passive night, so in the active night of the sense, if I know that I need to curb my love of ice cream, I can stop buying it. I can measure how much I eat. I can count calories. That's the active night of the sense. The passive night of the sense would be if all of a sudden, let's just say, I love ice cream, and all of a sudden that desire just vanishes in my life, and it leaves such a hole that I don't know how to live without my ice cream. All right, that would be an example of a passive night of the sense. Now, they also play out in the spiritual realm, or the spiritual aspect of the person. So same thing. The active night of the spirit is going to therapy, or going to confession, or going to talk to your spiritual teacher and tell them how you broke all the rules that week. The passive night of the spirit is technically the dark night of the soul. Okay? The dark night of the soul is the passive night of the spirit. It is when God or the divine or the universe, however you understand the universe, completely pulls the rug out from underneath your life. Your safe, secure little world, your safe, secure job, or marriage, or relationship with your children, or whatever it is, and it's boop, everything goes inside out or upside down or just fades to black. And to John of the Cross, these experiences sometimes last years. Some people that are in a religious life, it might last decades. Can you imagine that? If you enter a monastery or a religious community because your whole desire in life is to pursue your beloved, your divine, and that pursuit basically plays cat and mouse with you. You gave up everything to go into this monastery, only to enter into the complete darkness of unknowing. Where are you, God? Okay. To John of the Cross, these are the experiences that purify us, because it's easy to be a practitioner when you get a reward It's very Pavlovian. I'm going to sit on my meditation cushion for 20 minutes, or I'm going to pray the 99 names of God, and I'm going to feel better about myself, or I'm going to feel more peaceful, or I'm going to feel like God patted me on the head. It's easy to be a practitioner when you're being rewarded. It's not easy to be a practitioner when it feels like God hates you. And every single day when you sit down on your cushion, it feels like there's a screw being drilled into your brain. Because for people that do the practices, not just because it's like, you know, there's always a first fervor when it's exciting and it's new and it's like, oh, I can't wait to meditate again today. And then 5 months or 5 years later, it's like, I would rather not live anymore than have to meditate today. Right? It can get really hard. And for John of the Cross, that's when the rubber hits the road, and that's when the actual purification of the self happens. Okay? What does that purification of the self look like? It happens in 3 different areas. It happens on our intellects. So our cognitive processes are transformed. Our habitual stories that we tell about ourselves and about other people and about the world, they are eradicated. Okay? Our memory. When John of the Cross talks about memory, he's invoking a long tradition in Christian theology that goes all the way back to St. Augustine. When he talks about memory or memoria, he's not talking about remembering what you ate for breakfast. He's not talking about remembering the color of your favorite sweater. Sometimes the analogies, they don't work. He's talking about memory in the sense of being made in the image and likeness of God. Remembering who you are in the deepest identity of yourself. We forget. That is the transformation at this level. It's a transformation of memory into remembering who you are, that you are made in the image and likeness of God. And then the last piece is the will, right? Will is fun. We like to have free will. I got to choose what kind of Thai food I wanted to eat tonight. It was joyous, right? There are moments in our life where we feel like our will is, our hands are bound, powerless, right? Again, to go back to the recovery or the AA analogy, right? There are times in our lives where we feel powerless, whether it's about our addictions, our attachments, our aversions, our partners, our children, our parents, our president. Sorry, you knew that was coming somewhere tonight. Powerless to make change. How do we show up in those moments? Do we have a tantrum? Or do we sit on our cushion? You know, do we have ways to, how do we work it out? Like, how do we show up when our hands are, when we feel like our hands are bound? These are the moments that purify us and actually deepen our practice, if we can stay with them. So that's the thing for John of the Cross, is that when stuff gets difficult, stay with it. Stay with it. Stay with it. Right? Don't chase the high. Don't chase the experience. And I don't have time. I have all this stuff here on the dark night of the soul and all the different paths, because I always over prepare. And we don't have time to get into all this stuff, because what I want to really focus on is this, because this will take us back to the psychedelic question. Right? John of the Cross was very suspicious of visions and visionary experience and spiritual experiences that might feel aromatic and flavorful and jasmine-y. And I said that because I'm in Berkeley. And like, he was very suspicious of these things because we can become attached to them. If every time you sit down to meditate and you see a blue light, it can be very compelling. You can start to meditate so you can have an experience of the blue light. Before you know it, you're focusing so much on the blue light that what are you really meditating on? Is this a fabrication of my mind? Is this really some sort of transcendent thing, right? That's what takes us into the psychedelic conversation, because for so many people, not everybody, but for so many people, particularly with DMT type experiences, it's all about the visions. And it's all about the journey. It's about the entities, where the entities come from, where are the machine elves, what's really constructing reality. I don't know what's real anymore. And then I'm going to quit my job, or I'm going to leave my wife, or I'm going to do like a whole story starts to spin out of the journey or the trip. You start to trip out on the trip. It's very easy to become attached to the stories and the images of our experiences on any variety of psychedelia. Right? These are the conversations that are probably happening here all the time, so I don't think I need to get into that. But for John of the Cross, it's very real, because for him, his profession is a prayer. He's a professional prayer. That's his job. He's a friar, he's a preacher, but he's a prayer. He's a contemplative. So he's spending a lot of his life in deep interior states, right? He's basically a professional meditator. So this is his whole thing. Neither must contemplatives place their eyes on interior imaginative visions. By so doing, individuals free themselves from the danger of discerning the true visions from the false ones, and deciding whether their visions come from an angel of light or darkness. Demonology was very real to people in the Middle Ages and early modernity. They must instead renounce all these things. He's basically saying, don't get attached. Don't get attached to the things that you see in your practice, because you don't know where they come from. And you can very easily just be fascinated by some, I don't know, sorry for this metaphor, turd from your own unconscious. Like, you don't want, it's the whole Buddhist thing about polishing the brick. You don't want to be just meditating on, I'm going to go there. You don't want to be meditating on your own feces, because it's really easy to do. Those of you that are long time meditators know it's so easy to just sit there and try to polish your unconscious for 45 minutes, until your timer goes off. You really haven't done anything in that time. I'm really sorry. It's just another way that the unconscious basically tries to trick us to fall in love with itself, because that's how our minds are wired. Right? The Christian mystical tradition has deep wisdom on this very aspect of being a practitioner. Right? There's my main research question or thesis of this evening. It's that, okay? That the Christian mystical tradition, particularly John of the Cross, has direct relevance to what it means to be a practitioner, period. Whether you're a psychonaut or you're a meditator or you're a jogger, or whatever, right? Don't focus on yourself. It's basically what he's saying. Even if the image is so fascinating and alluring, you think that it's coming from an angel of light. It's very easy to become attached to that angel of light and miss, what is it? The whole finger pointing at the moon thing from the Buddha. Right. Okay, so again, I had this whole thing on the dark night. I'm not going to do it. I basically already did it. I did it. I don't know why I have so many slides. So I had to bring a visual in here that's directly related to, there's so much beautiful visionary art here in this gallery space that's been so lovingly curated. And this is, of course, our friend Alex Gray and his journey of the wounded healer. Now, he's talking about the sort of shamanic journey where there's an illness that leads to some sort of dismemberment and then reunification or wholeness. But I don't think it's too much of a stretch to overlay this whole Christian mystical trajectory of purgation, illumination, and union over top of it, right? I used to think that illumination was some fancy, light-filled, angel's glory thing from above. As I have entered into midlife, and I know, yes, I am a lot younger than many of those in the room, but as I have entered into midlife, I have realized that one of the most valuable blessings of the Middle Passage that has redefined my understanding of illumination is that what gets illuminated is when all of the pieces of you are splayed out all over the floor so that you can see them. That is the greatest gift of all. To be able to see your innards fully, objectively made clear and manifest with a magnifying glass in front of you. Some of us, that happens in partnership. The initiations come in all sorts of ways. For some people, it's ayahuasca. They have this exact vision of themselves and their bowels being dismembered in front of them. Every single one you can see how it all puts together. This is you. All the ways you're full of shit. Sorry, I should have made that a nice statement. I'm trying to be nonviolent in my communication. And then maybe someday you get put back together again, right? But I think the illumination is not a vision of light. I think illumination in a lot of instances is a vision of our shadows, right? Which is ultimately a very, very great gift. Okay. This is a vision. Speaking of the John of the Cross, this is John of the Cross's own vision. This is a sketch that he did in his own hand of crucifixion of Christ. Very interesting perspective, by the way, if any of you are artists or art historians. Very, very, do not really ever see this sort of like God's eye view looking down on the crucifix. Very interesting.
Like the Father looking down.
Yes.
Like, wow.
It's very interesting. That's why, yeah, it's a very, very interesting. But this is, so John of the Cross, he drew this and he passed this on to a Carmelite nun, and they put it in a reliquary, and it still exists today in a Carmelite convent somewhere in Spain. Okay, I have all this. I over-prepared. That's what I did. It's what I do. I over-prepare. I'm an over-preparer. So I wanted to do this whole thing about Merton and two essays that he wrote that were published in this this magazine. And I don't have time. I don't have time to do any of it. But I want to read this quote because this is Merton writing to this woman here, Linda Sabbath, who was involved at this Richard Maurice Buck Memorial Society, which was out of McGill University in Montreal, in Quebec. So Linda Sabbath and Merton started to correspond. Some of Merton's richest writings about psychology of religious experience are in his correspondence with Linda Sabbath, because Linda Sabbath was having these like manic religious ecstasies. And she was a single mother. I think she had 3 kids. She was in her 30s. Like, she was recently separated from her husband, who I think tried to kill her. I mean, her life was like, she had a lot going on. And she was also having these like religious ecstasies of feeling like completely in love with God and the universe. So she's like, I'm going to write to Thomas Merton to try to get a handle on this stuff. So they enter into this like multi-year correspondence, 3 years. And this is something that Merton writes to Linda Sabbath about psychedelics. Very relevant to the John of the Cross stuff and our conversation earlier. Anybody here know who Zalman Schachter is? I included this here for Sam Shankov. So Zalman Schachter was a founder of a sort of a neo-Hasidic 20th century rabbinical movement called Jewish Renewal. So, and Merton and Zalman Schachter were also in correspondence. So Merton says, I know my friend Zalman Schachter is quite enthusiastic about psychedelics. My impression is that they are not all they are cracked up to be. Most of the accounts I have read seem to add up to what the Zen people call makyo, the illusions that one has to put up with patiently until one gets rid of them. I think that systematically induced makyo is hardly a good substitute for a genuine interior life. This is really the heart of Merton's criticisms of psychedelia. Chogyam Trungpa had a very, very similar take on this. Trungpa Rinpoche would sometimes give his students LSD when he wanted to play with them. He thought it was super samsara. That's what Trungpa called LSD, super samsara, because he thought that it was basically your own unconscious, like completely magnified, which in a lot of instances, that's kind of what you're getting. So this is Merton's criticism. What the visions, the insights, I mean, I feel like I'm more on the this is because I'm getting older, maybe. I'm more on the kind of Senex, like old kind of, I feel like I'm channeling that kind of conservatism around it. But I think we need a little more sobriety around this conversation because we have had so much hype about psychedelia and mysticism and psychedelic experience. But Merton is saying that what's happening if you're basically just meditating on yourself, if it's just your own psyche magnified by 20 or by 100, you know, and you come out of the experience and you're all high and manic and it's like, oh, I need to do. What if it's an illusion? What if when we crack open, what's in the psyche, what's in the unconscious, all sorts of stuff comes out, right? So this is Merton's concern. How do we develop what he calls a genuine interior life? And for him, he uses the language of Meister Eckhart, the ground. For him, the way that we find this sort of, let's call it a sober mysticism, is by identifying with the ground of our being. This is also Paul Tillich's language, the ground of our being. He says, identify with the ground and you won't worry too much about the weeds. Okay? The ground doesn't, and the ground can't be anything but good. God plants God's own seeds without you knowing or being able to do much about it. Just don't go cultivating weeds on purpose. This is some of the most beautiful, grounded, practical advice for, I think, anybody on a spiritual path. You don't have to create problems in your life. There's enough already. All right. So if psychedelics are helping you clear the weeds, great. If they're creating more weeds and tangles in your life, then maybe it's time to chill out. Right? Don't go cultivating weeds on purpose. It's this whole thing about systematically induced macchio. Right? We have enough, the mind struggles enough with illusion and delusion on its own. It doesn't need any super samsara to activate or increase our own fill in the blank, narcissism, grandiosity, whatever it might be. Okay. So I'm going to skip some of this stuff on mysticism and regression. This was the other researcher. He was a psychiatrist at McGill, Raymond Prince. He and Merton exchanged only a few letters, but in one of the letters, they get into this whole thing about mysticism and regression, mostly because Raymond Prince had a big LSD trip where he basically had this kind of regressive, very Oedipal Freudian experience with his mother on one of his early LSD trips. So he had this whole idea that psychedelics and mysticism have this whole regressive component, which of course they can, right? Because it's the psyche and it's the unconscious. And I would be very interested if somebody has or would write something about basically, like, I guess Stan Groff did this. He's sort of like a Freudian psychedelic researcher. I mean, this whole thing about the BPM, the prenatal matrices, this is all about the womb, right? And rebirthing. So, okay. Where do I, let me do this and then I'll do that and then we'll close, we can talk a little bit. Okay, so just to wrap this up, 1967, Merton starts to shift some of his attitude about the burgeoning psychedelic subculture. A 16-year-old girl named Suzanne wrote to him, and in his response to her, I can't remember if she asked him about LSD or something, but in his response he wrote, "I don't need LSD to turn me on. The birds turn me on." That's nice. It's innocent fatherly advice there. Matthew Fox, who many of you probably know. Matthew Fox is probably one of the more famous. He was actually a Catholic Dominican priest who, before he was excommunicated and became an Episcopalian, lived somewhere in San Francisco, used to do like Episcopal rave masses and stuff. So this was in 1967. Merton writes to Matthew Fox. He describes LSD as an intense and ill-regulated hunger for spiritual experience. Okay? So again, admitting that there's something underneath this. Lisa Bieberman, who's got some attention lately. I think the Harvard people that are doing psychedelic stuff over at Harvard, somebody over there just wrote a thing on Lisa Bieberman, who was involved in Cambridge in the 1960s with like kind of the first like organized underground psychedelic, I wouldn't call it a church, but a psychedelic movement. Merton tells her, "I have a great deal of respect for what you're doing." very interesting letter from August to a physician named John Aiken. The careful and occasional use of psychedelics can be quite helpful. And Merton, this is very fascinating. Merton expresses a desire to experience sacramental communion with indigenous people through peyote. He actually tells John Aiken that he would like to participate in a peyote ceremony so he could feel closer to indigenous people. Very interesting. Of course, my favorite photograph here. Rabbi Zalman Schachter takes a drive to Kentucky, gives Merton what's probably one of the most famous 1960s psychedelic artifacts, the psychedelic experience, and takes this rare photo of Merton smiling, wearing gloves. Why is he wearing gloves? Because he had terrible, I don't know if it was dermatitis, he had terrible skin conditions that he had to wear gloves. It was very painful for him to type. He was a writer. Anyway, there's a lot of stuff we can go into. What I want to conclude with is I've kind of already said this. This is just re-saying it in a different way. If you want to go deeper on your own, there's 2 essays in this book, Zen and the Birds of Appetite, which you can probably find a used copy for $1 at Moe's or Pegasus or somewhere. It's one of his more popular books. These 2 essays are the essays he wrote for this Montreal Society. And in this essay, who is it that has a transcendent experience? He really crystallizes some of what we've been talking about, where he's really concerned about this whole notion of delusion. This is the sentence here. He's basically talking about spiritual delusion, which aims to establish the ego, right? This is what Trungpa would call spiritual materialism. Spiritual practices, including psychedelic practices, that further reify the self. So that instead of purifying or stripping down or opening up or softening the self, it establishes it even more in what Merton calls its spiritual glory. It's basically a form of spiritual narcissism, which of course is pretty rampant in the Bay Area. Sorry. Is that too condescending and soapboxy of me, or is it true? It's over. Go for it. All right. Merton was really aware of this because not only was he a monk at this point for 25 years, but he was the novice master for the young monks that were entering the monastery. So he knew a lot about spiritual delusion and spiritual narcissism and spiritual egoism. Right. So for him, the psychedelic piece tied into that as just another thing that tries to establish or reestablish the ego. Okay. I did some. Part of the reason why it's okay for me to skip through some of this stuff is because this is all published. This is a shameless plug, but it's free. It doesn't cost you any money. All this stuff is published in an article that came out last year. So if you want to go back and read this, like it's long. It's like a 40-page article. So if you want to go into this and if you want all the quotes and all the stuff that I read tonight, it's all here and it's free and it's I have it on my website here. So like you can just go and read it. So that's why some of the stuff that I'm skipping over. Exactly. So what I will say is that towards the end of his life in 1967, he died the next year. Merton's approach to not just psychedelics, but the human beings that were involved in the psychedelic counterculture starts to shift and soften. Okay. So this is Merton in a spoken monastic conference. What are you doing back there?
I have a flavor.
Oh,
Sorry.
I was like you were hiding or something. So this is Merton. This is him in a monastic conference to his young monastic audience. Pray a great deal for the people that take LSD in this country. Let's do that. Let's pray for them. Let's do that tonight. This is quite a phenomenon. And this is what he says. I would like to say straight off that these people are much more interested in contemplation than anybody here in this monastery. So he's validating the authenticity of this sort of resurgence of interest in psychedelics because he sees that underneath it or in it is a hunger for something that's real. It's a hunger for mysticism. It's a hunger for spirituality. Merton lived as a hermit on the grounds of his monastery the last 3 years of his life. And up in his hermitage, he had his own tape recorder. So he would like record himself, like doing like almost like some of it's spoken word poetry, but he would like take notes on his recorder. So we have all these in archived. So I found some of them on Psychedelics. And this is, we'll close with this. One of the most fundamental needs of modern persons, a need for exaltation, right? To exult, to be joyful. Or to put it in our own terms, the need to be turned on. He's not talking sexually. Okay. A need to find some kind of release inside that will, and I apologize for the male language, will enable him to let go completely and feel that he or she has found something that gives life meaning, something that is the key to happiness, especially if it happens to unite someone with others. It's this happiness, not just of interior peace, but a kind of momentary self-transcendence. Rather than the capacity to dig into the ground, so here's the ground again. I would say that within all discussion of mysticism, we have to distinguish between a mysticism of exaltation, which transports us into what we are not or what we cannot be, or another kind of mysticism, which is perhaps not mysticism, which simply goes deep into the ground of what one is. A mysticism of is-ness, a mysticism of existence, a mysticism of accepting what is here and now right in front of your nose. Now, the Sufis, I'm making a plug for the workshop tomorrow. The Sufis of the 9th and 10th century in Baghdad made this distinction between a mysticism of intoxication and inebriation and a mysticism of sobriety. These were two different schools that emerged very early in the Sufi Islamic ethos. And Merton is naming this and reframing this, unintentionally, in regards of our contemporary scene. Because what's happening now, as because it's a resurgence of the 60s, it's very similar. I like this idea of a mysticism of exaltation, which is important. We have to be able to release, feel a sort of self-transcendence, a kind of joyfulness, a unity experience with the cosmos. But in my experience of living in California for the last decade and being involved in certain communities that I will name, for example, ecstatic dance, yoga communities, psychedelic circles, lots of men's groups, California, Bay Area men's groups, there is a tendency to want to stay up and out. There is a tendency to want to transcend and stay in spaces of transcendence. What Merton is talking about in this idea of a mysticism of the ground is much more of an ordinary, it's the kind, to go back to the Zen piece, it's the ordinary awareness of what it is and who it is that's in front of you. It's a mysticism of presence. It's a mysticism of the earth and the ground beneath your feet. It's a mysticism that involves the own human frailty and fragility of our own aging human bodies, which includes questions of what happens to us in our consciousness when that body ceases to function. Right? It's easy to avoid and evade the hard questions of life when we get stuck in a mysticism of up and out. Right? So I think Merton can be a guide for us, and I think people like John of the Cross and other wise figures in the Christian mystical tradition can be elders and guides and voices from the beyond to shepherd and support those of us who are trying to find our way in this very slippery slope of spirituality and mysticism, whether psychedelic or not, so that we can be people of the ground, so that we can be integrated people, so that we can be fully human and fully divine, which is the crux of the Christian ethos to begin with. Okay, so I'm going to land the plane there, 5 minutes after 9. I'm happy to hang out. If you have to go to sleep, you can go to sleep. There's couches.
They can't
I'm-
sleep on the couch.
I'm also happy to hang out if you wanted to. If you want to do Q&A, I'm happy. Like we can do that. I'm happy to hang out. But if people got to go, don't feel like you're rude if you want to leave. So I will end my part here and say thank you. I appreciate you attending and your attention and staying up late on a Friday night here at the Alembic. Thank you. Okay.
Logistics proposal, which is why don't we do 10-ish minutes of Q&A in the room, and then do we have snacks?
They're cookies.
And then we can go to the lobby for like an informal sit around and have cookies. So maybe 10 minutes of Q&A here while we have the slides. Does that sound good to people? Okay, cool.
Can you go back to the slide with the one to the site?
The last, yeah.
This one?
No, the one with the site to go look at.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Was Merton's personal experience or mystical experience more on the is-ness side or more on the transcendent side or both?
That's a great question. Merton's journals are filled with some of the most beautiful writing in Merton's journals are his experiences in nature. His nature writing rivals Henry David Thoreau's, Walden and Thoreau's journals. And other people have said that too. That's not just me. His nature writing is exquisite, particularly his nature writing from when he was in the California coast. It's extraordinary. So a lot of his experiences of the divine came through his time in nature. There are at least 2 experiences that Merton writes about in his journals that scholars or readers refer to as his sort of mystical illuminations or awakenings. One was in March of 1958. It happened in a busy intersection at the corner of 4th and Walnut in downtown Louisville, where he had this experience where he saw all of the people around him shining like the sun. It's an extraordinary account. I didn't talk about that tonight because I talked about that when I was here last year, but that's a very famous account. If you do a Google search for Thomas Merton, 4th and Walnut, you'll be able to read the whole passage. It's him reveling in his humanity. He has a line that says, I feel like I'm the winner of some cosmic sweepstakes, the joy of being a human being. You don't see that a whole lot in the Christian narrative. You see it in Tibetan Buddhism. They take human incarnation very seriously in Tibetan Buddhism because it's a very special and unique opportunity to do a certain kind of spiritual practice. You don't hear that a lot in the Christian tradition. The second was when Merton was in Polonnaruwa in Sri Lanka. That's the giant Buddha grove, the giant Buddha statues, the reclining Buddha. It's not the Buddha sleeping, it's the Buddha on his deathbed. And Merton approached those statues barefoot. And he had an experience where he basically had an experience of what he understood as the Dharmakaya, right? So here he is, a Catholic Christian monk, in weeks before he dies, standing barefoot in front of the dying Buddha, framing his spiritual experience in Tibetan language. Very interesting. The Dharmakaya, the realm beyond the realm, the origination point of all that is. Anybody else want to help me out with talking about a concept that's absolutely impossible to conceptualize? The ground.
Yeah.
The ground. The ground of all being. Yeah.
Can you go back to the slide with St. John of the Cross's description? Like he's talking about like not getting held up with the illusions.
Yes.
So we didn't read this one quote, but I just sort of I did.
Which
And
this one?
Yeah, fix the bottom one.
Oh yeah, that's a good one. I missed
found this
that.
to be really support because I felt like okay, we're talking about like visions. We struggle with the discernment of the truth of them, but then it kind of felt like he provided like a way of working with it that was grounding. Because I was going like, okay, well, what do I do with all the visions? And he was like, okay, but like, this is me just trying to say what I found was valuable. He says like endeavor to preserve the like spirituality that they invoke. And that felt like a really supportive frame that we just like didn't talk about. So I just wanted to like kind of acknowledge that I was here and that it gave me a sense of like, what do I do with the visions? I don't focus on the visions. I focus on like the impact it has on my spiritual
Great.
life.
Yes. Yeah, so he uses this phrase, valuable spirituality. So, that can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. So don't get hung up on the flashing lights, but underneath that, there might have been some experience of truth, or where you felt that you were able to experience something in the core of yourself without illusion. Focus on that and then put that into practice. Again, this is very practical, right? He's mostly writing for, they weren't monks, they were friars, but he's writing for friars and he's writing for Carmelite sisters who are cloistered. So he's writing to people basically like us today who are serious about our spiritual life. It's something, he wasn't interested just in theory. He was almost entirely interested in practice. Yeah, thanks. That's a great, was there something else there for you? Or?
No, I just wanted to highlight that I found that actually very helpful. And I wasn't said out loud, so I wanted to make sure other people saw it.
Yeah.
I'm still kind of trying to figure out how I want to build this question, because I guess I kind of want to borrow this phrase, problematize something I feel like is
Good doctoral student right there.
Yeah, you gotta get the verbiage in there. But I feel like there's something underpinning Merton's entire critique of psychedelics that I'm curious to try and dissect a little bit more. And I think that I would say that what's underpinning it is this fundamental assumption that the psychedelic is modulating the human experience in such a way that is transferable to the way that we modulate our experience via something like meditation or Zen or ritual practice or prayer or whatever. And that, I think there's that whole perennial line. But I think what's totally left out and should be there in the conversation around psychedelics, and not to say that all psychedelics are like this, but most psychedelics are natural. And you often talk about his nature writing. So I almost see a kind of spiritual argument for psychedelics in much the same way you can make an argument for, the concession of the saints in Catholicism, that you're working with a psychedelic and that psychedelic has a consciousness, and you are sitting there as the student with that as a teacher, and it has nothing to do with you. It has nothing to do with your consciousness or your visions. It maybe doesn't even really have to do with God in that way. It's about communing with another being. And I guess it just surprises me that there didn't seem to be a thread of that there.
Point well taken. I think a big part of that is because he didn't have any experiences himself. So he's basing this whole conversation on his own intuitions and assumptions and his own experience, basically.
Like, problem. He had obviously it was around him, but he never took it.
Yeah, I mean, we're basically having a whole conversation about somebody who's critical of psychedelics without ever having his own psychedelic experience, and 20 people showed up for that. But but the reason, why, right? Because I think there's a really sort of salty, very practical, earthy, spiritual practice piece behind it. And that's what I was really trying to emphasize and highlight. But that's his whole thing in, so first to respond to your question, so to bring Huxley back into the conversation, there's a reason why he called his book The Doors of Perception. But his whole thing was that psychedelics cleanse, this is a William Blake quote, cleanse the doors of perception that you can see reality as it is, which is infinite. So Huxley's coming from not the Macchio illusion, spiritual materialism perspective. He's coming at it from no, this is actually the pathway to purify your consciousness and see reality as it is. I mean, those of you that have had, high doses of psilocybin or MDMA, that one of the results of that is you see colors and reality sparklingly clear, sometimes for weeks. Maybe that's what reality looks like. And then all of a sudden, blue is just blue again. Oh yeah, rainbows, they're just the thing that happens, particles and the sky and the rain and moisture. You don't see, we cease to see reality as the miracle that it is because we become habituated to our own ordinary existence, and life just becomes string beans and Brussels sprouts. Brussels sprouts are pretty good. Didn't appreciate them until I was in my 40s. See what I'm saying? So it's a perspectival shift. For Huxley, it's for Merton, it's illusion.
Well, that actually brings me to another question I wanted to ask, which is, I mean, I know Merton was interested in Blake, but I mean, the Blake piece of it is a great piece. But Blake is the most visionary, clearly, I mean, he couldn't have done any psychedelics, but I mean, talk about psychedelic experiences. He's hallucinating his dread brother all the time. Like, I mean, what would Merton do with that? Merton is biased in his. I saw your hand over there. I promise to get to you. There is a whole history of visionary mysticism in the Christian tradition. You're probably familiar with Hildegard of Bingen. Hildegard of Bingen, extraordinary German 11th century Benedictine nun. She was an abbess. She was an incredibly powerful woman who had political influence in her time. She was visionary. Illuminated manuscripts of her visions exist. I mean, there is a great respect in the tradition for visions and visionary experience. It just happens to be that John of the Cross and Merton, who comes out of that more ascetic, skeptical kind of framework, that's his framing of psychedelia, right? But he also obviously respected Blake. He did his master's on Blake. It's just a different kind of thing. I think it's his tendency. It's like if you had an Enneagram for mystics, he'd be like the apophatic darkness type. Other people might be Enneagram, visionary, cataphatic, tactile types. Did I just invent something? Is there a workshop with Enneagram for mystics? It must exist. There's types. There's got to, I'm not the first person to think that book I mentioned earlier by this philosopher named Stace that came out in the 60s was all about mystical types, the nature-based and the introverted types and whatever. That was not, Merton had a very specific type, and I think ultimately he was a very concrete, earthy, grounded person who really just wanted to do his Zen meditation and then drink a beer and go to bed. He loved beer. He did. Lots of lauding of beer in his journals. Okay. So last one, please.
Probably a short answer. I was wondering if St. John of the Cross ever studied alchemy, because you mentioned he used alchemical metaphors.
Great question.
His writing, and I noticed in some of his sort of schema, it looked sort of alchemical. So.
I wrote a chapter on my dissertation about John of the Cross and alchemy. Did you happen to know that, sir? Let me tell you, when you start doing this stuff, this never happens unless you pay the person to do it.
So maybe long answer.
Tricky. So the very short answer is I think so. Alchemy. So he's writing in the 16th century, 15th, 16th century. They were still alchemists. Alchemy was still part of the culture, the ethos. The kings, the royal people had the alchemy. They were the patrons of alchemists. So these people existed in the 1500s, like John Dee, who was the alchemist Queen Elizabeth, and so it would have been in the consciousness of the culture. It basically would be your local chemist or something. So these people would have existed. He would have known, who and what an alchemist was. He probably would have known what an alembic is. How about that, right? But it did not have the kind of Gnostic connotations that alchemy has today. Alchemy in the Middle Ages and late Middle Ages was very Christian. It became Christianized. The Philosopher's Stone was a metaphor for Christ, or Christ would be a metaphor for the Philosopher's Stone. So that's the short hand.
Sweet.
Yeah. lots of alchemy and John of the Cross. Okay, it's 20 after 9. It's time for bed or tea or both, apparently. Thank you again so much for being here. Thank you for taking planes to come here. So happy to spend this evening with you. And if you want to do it all again tomorrow, only in a very different way, but a similar way, come back at 10 o'clock. All right. Thank you again, everyone. Have a nice night. Get home safe.
Thank you again, David Odorisio, everybody. David, what's the best way to keep in touch with you? Is it that link that you put up? Do you have a mailing list?
Oh, yeah. You can. So I don't know if you know what academia.edu is. It's like Facebook for not nerds. It's like Facebook scholarly nerds. You might have to create a free profile to access this, but it doesn't cost you any money. You can send me a message through that, my page there. That's fine. I also have a website. It's a home for soul. A home for soul. A home for soul. You can contact me through my website too. I'd be happy to follow up with any of you.
Thank you. Okay, everyone's favorite part of everything, logistics. You can leave your stuff where it is because we're going to be back here tomorrow, 10 a.m. And then there are cookies in the lobby thanks to Jay. Jay, thank you for the cookies.
Girl Scout cookies.
So everyone who wants to go to sleep is free to go to sleep. Apparently everyone who wants to take a nap on the couch, according to Emily, it's fine to do that. And if you'd like, we can abscond to the lobby for cookies and tea. Mugs go in the bus bin in the lobby.